So thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I wasn't sure until very recently whether I would be here in person, but I'm glad to be here, and I look forward to the week. But we'll start tonight with this talk, and this talk is we'll start tonight with this talk, and I think the title that's on all the posters is The Skill of Sensory Imagination. I did a sort of last-minute switch on my own, and I'm calling it The Case for a Skills-Based Approach to Imagination, but it really is a talk about the skill of sensory imagination. Okay, so I will get started. So over the course of her illustrious career, the writer Ursula Le Guin published 23 novels, 13 children's books, and nearly 30 other collections of essays, short stories, and poetry. And her writing is frequently praised for both its breadth and its imagination, and she herself has been described as having a wondrous imagination, one that was carefully tuned when she was a child. And Le Guin herself actually frequently reflects on the role of imagination in her life and in her writings. So for example, in her essay called Operating Instructions, she describes imagination as an essential tool of the mind, a tool that's indispensable for our humanity. And then she goes on to suggest that this mental capacity is one that we should take care to cultivate. So she says we have to learn to use it and how to use it like any other tool. Children have imagination to start with, as they have body, intellect, the capacity for language, things essential to their humanity, things they need to learn how to use well. Such teaching, training, and practice should begin in infancy and go on throughout life. Young human beings need exercises in imagination as they need exercise in all the basic skills of life, bodily and mental, for growth, for health, for competence, for joy. And this need continues for as long as the mind is alive. So Le Guin, in these remarks, she casts imagination as a skill. So it's one acquired at birth, but one that must be practiced in order to be improved. And this is a point that she returns to throughout her essays. So for example, in her essay called Making Up Stories, she says that imagination, like any basic human capacity, needs exercise, discipline, and training, both in childhood and lifelong. Now, interestingly, as intuitive as it is, and we see the intuitive nature of this kind of remark about imagination in this quote, as intuitive as it is to treat imagination as a skill, this way of conceptualizing imagination has largely been absent from the historical discussion about imagination in philosophy, and I've been trying to correct that over the last few years. Now, we do occasionally see some remarks in passing where people make reference to imagination being a skill. So for example, Paul Taylor claims that exercising imagination is, quote, to engage a particular mental skill. And Taylor's remark there that I just quoted comes in the context of discussion of imagination specifically. Sometimes we find these remarks about imagination being a skill elsewhere. So Daniel Dennett, who I don't usually count as one of my allies, but in this context he is saying here, we're all connoisseurs of the pains and pleasures of imagination, and many of us would consider ourselves experts in the preparation of these episodes we all enjoy so much. But we may still be surprised to learn just how powerful this faculty can become under serious training. I find it breathtaking, for instance, that when musical composition competitions are held, the contestants often do not submit tapes or records of live performances of their works. They submit written scores, and the judges confidently make their aesthetic judgments on the basis of just reading the scores and hearing the music in their minds. So the idea is that the judges exercise this kind of imaginative skill of hearing the music that's only written on the paper in order to judge which piece should win the competition. So that's an instance where we find someone referring to imagination as a skill outside the context of discussions of imagination in particular. This comes from his book, Consciousness Explained. So as I alluded to a moment ago, I have been working over the last few years to focus some more sustained philosophical attention on the claim that imagination is a skill. And so I've been working to develop a skills-based a skills-based framework for imagination. And then I've also worked to put this framework to use. So to my mind, there are a number of different philosophical contexts in which we can resolve a puzzle or we can make new progress on a thorny issue by taking seriously the fact that imagination is a skill, and correspondingly that imaginative abilities will vary from person to person and that they can be improved. So what I am going to do in this talk today is to bring together some of my recent work in an effort to make the comprehensive case for a skills-based framework. So this is a sort of greatest hits, so to speak, of some of my recent work. I'm going to try and bring various things together. So the paper is going to start off. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to treat imagination as a skill. Then I'm going to take up some common objections to the claim that imagination is a skill and show why those objections are mistaken. Then I'm going to discuss some philosophical payoffs that I think we see from treating imagination as a skill. And I'm going to talk about two philosophical puzzles in particular, the puzzle of imaginative resistance and the puzzle of transformative choice, and show how thinking of imagination as a skill will help us in those contexts. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to be running out of time, so I'm just going to say very briefly in a conclusion, I'm going to try and draw a larger moral for philosophy from thinking about imagination as a skill. Okay, so let me get started into the talk and into talking about what it means to treat imagination as a skill. And for those of you who are familiar, I know some of you have maybe read some of my work in a preparatory seminar for today, so some of this should be familiar, but hopefully the review will help. So in order to talk about what it means to say that imagination is a skill, I want to talk just a little bit about how philosophy treats imagination. So in contemporary philosophy of imagination, imagination is treated as a speculative mental activity, a speculative form of mental representation, one that takes us in some way beyond the here and now. So here is Lau and Gendler in their Stanford Encyclopedia article on philosophy, encyclopedia article on imagination. They say, to imagine is to represent without aiming at things as they actually, presently, and subjectively are. So we in some way go beyond that. And when it comes to imagination, I think we can see philosophers discussing at least three different types of imagination. So what I'm here calling propositional imagining, imagistic imagining, and experiential imagining. So when I imagine that there are freshly baked brownies on the kitchen counter, my imagining takes a propositional form. I'm imagining that such and such is true. So this is propositional imagining. Philosophers tend to treat it as a propositional attitude akin to other propositional attitudes like belief. And in fact, a lot of the work on propositional imagination takes the form of distinguishing propositional imagining from belief. This kind of imagining is often referred to as belief-like imagining. Now, I might, instead of imagining that there are freshly baked brownies on the kitchen counter, I might just imagine the brownies themselves. And when I do this, my imagining takes a perception-like or imagistic form. Now, when I say imagistic here, I want the notion of image to be understood in an extended sense, so one that isn't necessarily confined to the visual domain, but rather applies across all the sensory modalities. So just as there are visual images, there are also, in this sense, auditory images or gustatory images, and likewise for the other senses. So when I'm imagining the tray of brownies, I might do that not only by imagining them visually, what they look like, but I also might imagine, say, what they smell like, right? That nice smell of brownies straight from the oven. Okay, so finally, experiential imagining is not propositional in nature, and it's not just forming a visual image, but it's to think of imagining on analogy to experience. So consider a case in which I imagine biting into the brownie and burning my tongue. This imagining takes an experiential form, one similar in some way at least, to the experience of actually biting into the brownie and burning my tongue. So now this is a three-part distinction, a tripartite distinction between these three different kinds of imagining. But in practice, I think we can see it as a two-part distinction or bipartite distinction because I am going to group together imagistic imagining and experiential imagining under the heading of sensory imagining. Now, we can motivate this grouping in different ways. One way is to treat imagistic imagining as a subtype of experiential imagining. We might also motivate it by treating, stretching the notion of imagery beyond the straight five senses, but allow the notion of image to refer to experiential sensory presentations as well. That's how I prefer to motivate the grouping, but it's not really going to matter here. Now, I think the skills-based framework is applicable to both propositional imagining and sensory imagining, but I think it's most natural when we talk about skills-based conception of imagination to think of sensory imagination. And so given that, and given the focus of people here on sensory imagination, I'm going to just be focusing on sensory imagination in my talk today. But let me make one more preliminary point before I go on to develop the framework. So when we think about my imagining of the brownies, sometimes it serves a sort of escapist purpose. So I might be stuck in a boring meeting and I'm craving some escape, so I'm craving a sweet dessert, and I find myself daydreaming about finding freshly baked brownies on my return home. So that's one purpose that my imagining the brownies might serve, but I also, sometimes that imagining might serve a more practical purpose. So I might be trying to decide what dessert to bring to an upcoming department gathering, right? Should I bring cookies, or should I bring a tray of fruit, or should I bring brownies? And it's by imagining these different possibilities that I'm helped to make the decision of what dessert to bring. So in previous work, I've distinguished these different kinds of uses, calling them transcendent imagining, that's the escapist imagining, and instructive imagining, that's the more practically oriented imagining. I think we use transcendent imagining when we're daydreaming, when we're engaging in fantasy, when we're engaging with fiction, when we're playing games of pretend, whereas we use instructive imagining in these other contexts, like where we're making decisions, where we're planning, where we're engaging in thought experimentation, mind reading, by which I mean the process of explaining and predicting the behavior of someone else on the basis of trying to understand their mental states. So transcendent uses, we're trying in some way to escape the world in which we live. Instructive uses, we're trying in some way to learn about the world in which we live. There might be imaginings that do a little bit of both, but I'll treat them as two different classes. Okay, so I actually think that both transcendent and instructive imagining are plausibly understood as skills, but as we'll see, they're importantly different from one another. Okay, so, but it's not as if only one of these kinds of imagining is a skill. Okay, so now I can talk about the skills-based framework more directly. Now, for some reason, when I was putting together this paper, all of my examples started becoming very personal. So you'll forgive me that my family is going to get featured a lot, and myself in the various examples. Okay, so over the years, I've watched my sons, who are now teenagers, tackle a bunch of new activities. So that wasn't supposed to pop up first. But anyway, they both started playing soccer competitively when they were young kids. More recently, they've been playing high school volleyball. They've taken piano lessons. In elementary school, they learned to juggle. So first they were juggling balls, and then clubs, and then much to my consternation, they were juggling knives. At one point, my older son spent some time mastering ping pong, and my younger son has dedicated time to getting scuba certifications. My older son has done Wordle every day. I don't know if you do Wordle here, but no. Anyway, yes, okay. My younger son does Sudoku and Ken-Ken. So I tell you all this not just to tell you about my sons, but because it gives you a list of different kinds of skills that one might have, and also skills that cover quite a range. So, all right, as long as I pulled it out. Oh, it's not going to play. Oh, there he goes. That's the juggling knives. Just, you know, since I had it there. Okay, so I'm a proud mom, yes, but the point, as I said, the point of mentioning all of these things is to give you a sense of the different kinds of skills that we all might work towards at times in our life, right? Whether it's musical or mathematical or athletic or cerebral. But even though these different skills are very different from one another in many ways, there are still some basic features that the activities have in common. And so I'm going to focus on 3 features that are typical of activities that are classified as skills. So first, when an activity is a skill, it can be done, it's something that one can be better or worse at. It can be done more or less well. So my older son's better than my younger son at playing ping pong, but my younger son is better than my older son at Sudoku. But now to say that someone has a skill, so to say that my son is skilled at ping pong or my son is skilled at Sudoku, is to say that they're better than baseline at a given activity. Okay, so to be skilled at something, you're better than baseline at it. Now, if we compare these kinds of activities, like playing ping pong or doing Sudoku, if we compare those to activities that are not skills, like the activity of shutting a window or of waving, we can see that shutting a window isn't something that can be done more or less well, or waving is not something that can be done more or less well. We don't talk about people at being better than others at shutting the window. I mean, there might be some windows that are particularly difficult to shut and you need strength, but that just the activity of shutting a window is not something that can be done more or less well. Okay, so now what it means for an activity, a skilled activity, to be able to be done more or less well will vary from activity to activity. So sometimes it might have something to do with speed, sometimes complexity, accuracy, gracefulness, or something else altogether. All right, so the second feature is that when something is a skill, it's improvable via practice or training, right? And what exactly is involved in the training will vary depending on the activity. So when my older son was learning to play soccer, he got explicit training from a coach, right? He was given specific training exercises to work on, and then he went to organized practice sessions with other players. But in contrast, when he was learning a trick shot at ping pong, he didn't receive explicit training from anyone else at all. Rather, what he did was watch a bunch of YouTube videos and then spent hours and hours and hours in the backyard at the ping pong table trying to replicate what he had seen on the YouTube videos. Okay, and in engaging in that kind of practice, he also recorded himself and watched the videos in order to determine what he could do better the next time. So different models of training, sometimes explicit training sessions with others, sometimes self-training, but there's practice and training involved in activities that are skills. And finally, the third feature that I'll mention is that when an activity is a skill, it's under someone's intentional control. So an unskilled Sudoku player might sometimes complete a difficult puzzle, and an unskilled juggler might occasionally manage to keep the balls in the air for a few tosses. But if their successes just arise from guesswork or from luck, then their performances don't count as skilled. So we might consider Gilbert Ryle's example of the skilled clown. So the skilled clown trips and tumbles just as clumsy people do, except that he trips and tumbles on purpose and after much rehearsal and at the golden moment and where the children can see him and so as not to hurt himself. So the clumsy person's stumbles are just clumsiness, right, accidental, but the clown's stumbles are deliberate and controlled. So they are under the intentional control of the clown. Okay, so now turning to sensory imagination, we can ask ourselves how these features are manifested there. So here are a couple of more examples. Now, I did make up these examples before I flew, so this is not about anyone in particular that I was sitting next to, but I was imagining what my flight might be like. So first example is what I'll call the case of imaginative revenge. So consider a transatlantic traveler who had the bad luck to be seated next to someone who's taking up well more than their share of space in the already confined row of seats. So as his leg pushes against hers and his arm pushes hers off the armrest, and as she struggles to get comfortable in her shrinking space, she starts to imagine ways that she might get her revenge. So she pictures herself forcibly shoving his arm off the armrest and claiming it for herself. Or she pictures herself accidentally spilling her drink in his lap when he jostles her leg. And she also envisions nearby passengers breaking out into applause and cheering when she noticed what she's done. Okay, so that's the case of imaginative revenge. Not everyone who's seated next to an unrepentant man-spreader, is that word okay in German? Man-spreader? Okay. Not everyone who's seated next to an unrepentant man-spreader will engage in these kinds of escapist imaginings. And even among those who do, not everyone will be particularly good at it. So a meeker passenger might simply imagine claiming the armrest for herself when the other guy gets up to go to the bathroom. As far as revenge imaginings go, that one is pretty tame and uncreative. The imagining that we originally considered seems better, but there might be other imaginings that are better yet still. So someone might imagine hatching an elaborate plot with the flight attendants to make an announcement over the intercom that draws attention to the passenger in seat 26B. Or someone else might imagine waiting for the other passenger to fall asleep and then putting a sign on his chest that says, "I have no respect for other people," or writing that, something like that, across his forehead in Sharpie. In any case, these are all different kinds of imaginings that one might engage in. All right, the precise details of the imaginings don't deeply matter. What does matter is the underlying point that the imaginings differ from one another in how creative they are, how creative the revenge plots are, and these differences enable us to judge them as better or worse than one another with respect to imaginings. And of course, the dimension of creativity is just one dimension that we can measure imaginings on in terms of quality. So some of the imaginings might be more finely detailed than others. Some of them might be better elaborated than others. Some of them might be more vivid and evocative. Okay, so these two are all dimensions along which imaginings can be judged better or worse than one another. Now, there's no special reason to think that our transatlantic traveler, the one that I'm talking about here, has worked to improve her ability at escapist imaginings. But it does seem to be the kind of thing that she could easily do so if she were so inclined, right? The more she travels by public transport, the more she's likely to find herself in these uncomfortable situations, and so the more opportunities she might have to engage in these kinds of imaginings. So these repeat efforts function as practice, and they can help her to refine the various imaginative sub-skills, her ability to stretch her imaginings in more creative directions, her ability to fill in details, to maintain the imagining for longer, and so on. Those are all things that she can practice if she engages in them often enough. All right, now, as I described the case, the traveler undertook the relevant imagining on purpose. She set herself the imaginative task, and she directs its course as it goes. So as such, it seems reasonable to think of the imagining as being under her intentional control. Now, granted, there might be other cases of revenge imaginings that are not undertaken on purpose. You might just find yourself imagining horrible things to someone who has wronged you, right, without setting yourself the task and without controlling it. But even in those cases, even in cases where we don't initiate the imagining ourselves, you can often bring those imaginings under your intentional control once you discover that you're engaged in them. And when you do so, you can extend the course of the imagining further, take it in new directions, or maybe just stop the imagining altogether if you don't want to continue it. So you can exert intentional control over imaginative acts. Now, to say that these skilled activities are done under an agent's intentional control is not to say that the agent has intentional control over her imagining at every moment and in every way. So sometimes a skilled juggler might momentarily lose control of one of the balls that she's juggling. right? But even if there are times or respects in which the juggling is not under her control, in general, the skilled juggler will be in control of her imagining. And juggling is an activity that can be brought under intentional control. And I think things are similar when it comes to imagining. So there might be times when our transatlantic traveler is powerless to stop her revenge imaginings. Imagining is nonetheless an activity that can be under our intentional control. Okay, so that shows you how the three features of imagination as a skill come into play in this example. But of course, this is only one example. And moreover, this is a case where imagining is put to transcendent use, right? It's for escapist purposes. We might naturally wonder whether there can also be skills-based imaginings for instructive use. So I want to turn to a second example involving our transatlantic traveler, what I'll call the case of imaginative packing. Okay, so suppose that while she's on her trip, the traveler spends her last afternoon out shopping. And so she wants to buy these souvenirs and small gifts to bring home. But unfortunately, her suitcase was very, very full on her way out. She's not sure if she can fit these new items in, and they're expensive enough that she doesn't want to buy them if she can't fit them in. So what she does in the store, she doesn't have time to go back to her hotel to check. So what she does while she's in the store is to start imaginatively shuffling and reshuffling the items in her suitcase along with these potential purposes in an effort to see if she could repack her bag in such a way as to fit these new potential purchases into it. Right? So via this imaginative exercise, she might be able to figure out that she can just barely fit everything in if she repacks her bag in such and such a way. And if she's good at it, then sure enough, when she gets back to her hotel and packs up her stuff, everything will fit just as she's imagined, though it may very well be a tight squeeze as she imagined. Now, unlike the revenge imagining, the packing imagining is not an escapist imagining. It's done with a very practical purpose in mind. The traveler engages in the imagining to learn something, and so this is a case where imagining is put to instructive use. But while the purpose of the packing imagining is different from the purpose of revenge imagining, it still manifests all the typical features of skilled activity that we identified above. So just quickly, you can see that it's something that can be done more or less well. If you do it less well, you won't be able to actually repack the suitcase that way because you will have misimagined what's possible. It's the kind of thing that you can get better at. So in order to be good at this kind of imagining, you have to constrain your imagining appropriately to the size of the suitcase and the size of the items and the number of items that you have to pack. So there are all sorts of things that you have to be good at. You also have to be good at manipulating your imagining because you're shuffling and reshuffling things imaginatively as you're going. And we can think of ways that you might get good at manipulating things in imagination. So, for example, in the game Tetris, when the shapes fall, familiar with Tetris? When the shapes fall, you might visually rotate them to figure out where they would fit best. And so if you wanted to improve your imaginative skill, you could play a lot of Tetris and practice rotating. Here's a good excuse, right, to play a lot of Tetris. It will make you better at imagining as you mentally rotate the shapes. Now, those improvements are internal to the imaginative process. They involve a sort of direct attention to the skill. But there are other things that our traveler could do to improve her imaginative skill that are more direct. So for example, she might work to get better at attending, that are more indirect. She might work at attending to the size of her bag, and she might watch some how-to packing videos online. So the fact that one can improve a skill by indirect measures rather than just by direct measures is something that we should be familiar with. It's not at all an uncommon phenomenon. To give one example that's at least famous in the US, this is Karate Kid, the movie Karate Kid. Well, so famously in this movie, Mr. Miyagi teaches Daniel LaRusso how to excel at karate by first having him paint the fence and then wax the car and then sand the floor. And so these are indirect ways of improving his skill at karate. So what these examples suggest is that both transcendent and instructive imagining are skills. They're activities that are under one's intentional control. They can be done more or less well, and they're things that we can get better at with practice. What's required for instructive imagining to be done well will be different from what's required for transcendent imagining to be done well, but nonetheless, they both can be understood within the skills-based framework. Okay, so there are a couple of objections that I want to consider. And these are what I call the no practice objection and the no feedback objection. And I'm going to try and do this quicker than I intended because I think I'm running long. But basically, someone offering the no practice objection worries that there's no way for someone to engage in meaningful imagination practice. There's nothing that we can do. So what they tend to be thinking of in this case is they're thinking of activities like getting better at ping pong or at piano or at volleyball, and they think like, well, when you want to get better at those activities, there are these very obvious things you can do. Like you can sign up for lessons with a coach or with a teacher. You can watch videos online. What kinds of things would you do to get better at imagining? It's unclear what imaginative practice would look like. Now, someone offering the no feedback objection might grant that it's possible in principle to engage in practice, or it's just possible to do, but they worry that there's no way for the practice to be meaningful because there's no way for the imaginer to get useful feedback, right? And in general, feedback is necessary when you're trying to learn a skill. So you need to get correction from the piano teacher or from the soccer coach, so on. You have to figure out some way to get feedback, even if it's only self-feedback. Otherwise, how will you be able to improve? And the worry is that with respect to imagination and our imaginative attempts, we have no way to get feedback, no way even to give feedback to ourselves. There seems no way to judge someone else's imaginative activities, and thus no way an imaginer can be provided with any useful feedback for what they're doing or how they might improve. Also, there's no way to like record what you're doing, the way my son recorded himself when he was doing ping pong shots. So it looks like there's no way to give yourself useful feedback. Okay, so one thing we might do to combat these objections is just to point to people who are very good at imagining and say, look, they can do it, so there must be skilled imaginers. I'm going to just not worry too much about that right here. But even if we pointed, I actually think these are great examples and I've used them. I'm just going to move past them. Someone might worry that even if we give the examples of expert imaginers, it might be that just, oh, well, some people are born with better imaginative capacities, like in the way that some people are born with better eyesight than others. So there's nothing you can do to improve your eyesight. I mean, you can get glasses, but there's nothing you can do to improve your eyesight. And people might say there's nothing you can do to improve your imagination. You're either born with it, you excel at it, or not. But actually, there's good reason to think that this line of argumentation is mistaken. So research by psychologists Jennifer Cumming and Sarah Williams suggests that imagination is, quote, a collection of skills that are modifiable with training and experience, rather than simply a general, undifferentiated, fixed ability. Though they note that some individuals will be inherently predisposed to find imagining easier than others, they claim that one can work to become more proficient at imagining. They say imaginative skill, quote, can be honed and improved. But even though we can look at that empirical research to show that imagination can be improved, I want to do a little bit more to show you how it can be improved. Okay? And I think that insofar as the objections I was just mentioning, insofar as those have bite, it's that part of the problem is that imaginative practice is less regimented or formal than practice in other domains. So we just have to think about how such practice proceeds. And to my mind, children gain practice at transcendent imagining when they play games of pretend when they're young, especially when they do so in concert with others, because they might work to hone the game of pretend together, right, and push it forward. I guess most of us probably don't engage in games of pretend as adults unless we're doing so to entertain children. But acting lessons and improv games actually also will help you stretch your imagination. I think another obvious suggestion for how we can improve transcendent imagination is to engage with works of fiction. So I said there are no trainers or coaches when it comes to imaginative activities, but I think when you look to writers like Lewis Carroll or Tolkien or Madeline Engel, those writers serve, in some sense, as our coaches, right? They give us the opportunities to develop and stretch our imaginative capacities. We picture the creatures that are described, from the Cheshire Cat to the hobbits to Ant Beast, and as further details are revealed by the authors, we adjust and enhance the way that we picture those creatures. So we also imagine how the book might end, and once we're finished, we imagine alternate endings. We discuss the books with others, and discussions might lead us to revise the way that we imagine some of the scenes. So notice that we're getting feedback both from the book itself and from our conversations with others as we think about what to imagine. Interestingly, engagement with fiction not only helps us practice transcendent imagining, but it can also help us practice a kind of instructive imagining. In particular, the kind of imagining that aims to understand and empathize with others. So I think there are at least two different ways that fiction can help us get better at empathetic imagination. So first of all, it gives us materials that we need to work with. You can think of the source materials as a sort of imaginative palette, and so we can see fiction as expanding our imaginative palette. And also, when you think about the way we interact with people in everyday life, I think we don't often get as much information about what they're thinking and feeling. So not only does fiction give us more source materials, but it also gives us a kind of user's manual for how to engage with those source materials. So those are two different ways, I think, that engagement with fiction can help us do better at empathetic imagination. Now, all of these are informal imagination practice, but I want to note that I do think that there are ways that we can engage in formal imagination practice. So one place that this happens, I was behind on my slides, but one place that more formal imagination practice happens is in the domain of competitive athletics. So alongside their physical training, a lot of highly skilled athletes, and these are in sports ranging from figure skating to gymnastics to bobsledding, they've trained themselves to become highly skilled imaginers. And this often involves working with sports psychologists who give them very specific visualization exercises. So here's an example of a script that a sports psychologist has given one of the athletes. This is I think this is a canoeist. So you've just finished your this is a script that the athlete is using to help them practice imagining. You've just finished your warm-up and are ready to begin your race. You see the course in front of you as you wait in the starting pool. You see the other competitors and the spectators preparing for competition. And the script goes on. It's highly detailed. It's often found, the researchers often find that when people are working with scripts, these kinds of visualization exercises, it's very hard for them at first. And so you need to start with shorter scripts. And it's as their skill gets developed, they're able to handle more and more detail in the scripts that they're working with. Okay, so I've given you this example, and now we see how the practice might occur. I've given you various examples, right? The informal ones, and then this more formal one from these visualization exercises. But now remember, there was this other objection, which says, how would you get feedback? And how do we know that this practice is doing well? Well, unfortunately, a lot of the empirical research focuses on the development of so the empirical research with the athletes focuses more on the improvement of the athletic skill than on the imaginative skill, because they care about whether the canoeist is doing better or the figure skater is doing better at figure skating or at canoeing. But there have been some studies, at least one in particular that I find especially helpful, that did measure the improvement in imaginative ability, not just in the athletic performance. And that was a study with figure skaters, and they used various questionnaires both before and after the training. There was a control group or a different group who received just as much practice time, but the practice was in verbalization techniques rather than imaginative techniques. But the people who were engaged specifically in the imaginative techniques did do better on these various imagery measurement questionnaires after the practice than before. Okay, but still, how are they getting feedback? Even if they improved, how are they getting feedback? In general, maybe it's not just enough to repeat it. You have to get some kind of instruction or feedback on how one's doing. You need to get some sense of what can be improved or how things can be corrected. But I hope that given what I've already said, the objection doesn't seem very powerful. The imaginer working with a sports psychologist can report to the sports psychologist on what she's imagined. They can report what they found easier and what they found trouble with. And these reports allow for useful feedback from the trainer. And even if one isn't working with the trainer, I think someone who offers the no feedback objection is underselling the possibility and importance of self-feedback. So remember, in the ping pong example, my son was giving himself feedback. He wasn't working with a trainer. But I think that when a reader tries to imagine how a book will come out, right, as you're reading a book, you can get feedback as you go along because you read the rest of the book and you figure out, oh, how well did I do in imagining how the author was going to finish the story. So you can compare your imagining to the book's ending, and then you can think about what clues you might have missed along the way that you should have attended to better in an effort to improve your imagining the next time. So in short, I think it's just a mistake to think that there's no way to practice one's imagining, that there's no way to train one's imagining, and that one can't get feedback on one's imagining. And in a fitting twist of irony, the sense that these objections have bite seems itself to arise from a lack of imaginative skill, that is, from a failure of imagination in thinking about the possibilities for practice and for feedback. Okay, so I want now to discuss some philosophical payoffs, and hopefully I can further bolster the case for treating imagination within a skills-based framework by seeing the philosophical payoffs that arise from the adoption of this framework. So I'm going to talk about two puzzles, the puzzle of imaginative resistance and the puzzle of transformative choice. I'm going to try to do this quickly. Okay, so the puzzle of imaginative, those are my two payoffs. The puzzle of imaginative resistance dates back to Hume. Hume draws his reader's attention to a curious phenomenon. He says we often encounter speculative opinions in works of fiction that are contrary to our own, and when such opinions simply concern innocent matters and customs, it takes only a certain turn of the imagination for us to engage with them. But when they concern vicious moral principles, this is not the case. So as Hume notes, a very violent effort is requisite to change our judgment of manners and excite sentiments of approbation or blame, love or hatred, different from those to which the mind by long custom has been familiarized. So this puzzle that Hume is pointing to is now commonly referred to as the puzzle of imaginative resistance. It's come in for a lot of attention in recent years, the last few decades. The thought is that we have no trouble imagining worlds that are factually deviant from our own, so worlds where a kiss turns a frog into a prince, or where you can talk to your mirror and the mirror talks back to you. But although it's easy to do that, the thought is that we are either unable or unwilling to imagine fictional worlds that deviate dramatically from the moral facts of the actual world. So for example, worlds in which slavery or female infanticide is actually morally acceptable. Okay, not just a world where people think it is, but a world where it is, where infanticide is morally acceptable. The thought is that it's difficult to imagine that. So this is the famous sentence from Kendall Walton that is often discussed in the context of the puzzle of imaginative resistance. So if you were to encounter this sentence in a work, in Killing Her Baby, Giselda did the right thing. After all, it was a girl. Philosophers working on this puzzle use that as an example of where you would resist imagining this sentence. Maybe you would take various distancing maneuvers, right? So when you read in a story that the kiss turned the prince into a frog, or a frog into a prince, depending on, no, I guess it's the kiss is turning the frog into a prince. But in any case, when you get to that part of the story, you don't say to yourself, oh, that's something the narrator thinks, right? You just go with it. But when you encounter this kind of sentence in a story, you either stop imagining altogether, or you just distance it and you put it off onto the narrator. So there seems to be this asymmetry between the factually deviant cases and the morally deviant cases. Or at least that's the claim. Now, there have been various solutions proposed to resolve this puzzle. So one thing that people sometimes claim is that there's a conceptual impossibility, and that there's a certain kind of conceptual impossibility involved in matters of morality that make it impossible to imagine. Others reject this solution, and they say, look, we can imagine all sorts of conceptual impossibilities if they're adequately described, adequately disguised. And in fact, clever authors often do get us to imagine conceptual impossibilities by disguising various things. So I just mentioned Lewis Carroll. You might think that he was, that some of his works contain this kind of thing. I'm not going to review the standard proposals because I don't have time, but I want just to talk very quickly about how thinking of imagination as a skill can help us make progress with respect to this puzzle. So my solution or proposed solution starts by first noting the oddness of describing the relevant phenomenon, whatever's going on here, the relevant phenomenon in terms of resistance. So when we think of someone who's trying to master a new skill, right? So let's say we have a figure skater who's learning to try and do a double axel, and they might find the skill difficult and maybe more difficult than many other of the skating moves that they've been working on. But I think it would be strange to characterize this kind of difficulty that the skater is having in terms of resistance. Having difficulty with a task is not the same thing as resisting a task. So if we compare these two claims, the skater is having difficulty mastering this new skill. The skater is resisting mastering this new skill. I think both are things we might say, but they have a very different valence from one another. They mean different things. And the second report seems importantly different from the first, and indeed seems to imply a kind of willful failure that's missing from the first description. It's not implicit in the first report. Now, do we really find this sort of willful failure in the case of imaginative resistance? To my mind, insofar as there's a real phenomenon here of imaginative resistance to be discussed, it seems more analogous to the kind of phenomenon in the first report than in the second. So I think we've sort of gone astray by thinking of this phenomenon in terms of resistance. If we thought of it in terms of difficulty, I think things would be very different. And once we remember that imagining like figure skating is a skill, we're also reminded that there are gradations of difficulties in imaginative tasks. So insofar as readers of fiction have, you might say, considerably less practice in imagining morally deviant worlds, right? We are not given as many morally deviant worlds as we are given factually deviant worlds, so we have less practice imagining them. So the fact that those imaginings might be more difficult for us is not surprising. And I think that thinking of imagining as a skill often helps to make sense of why the resistance so often dissipates when we're provided further context. So one of the things that's often mentioned in discussions of imaginative resistance is, remember the sentence, we're just given the sentence completely out of context. And out of context, it's hard to know what we're supposed to do to imagine it. But we can lessen the difficulty of the imagining by filling in more details, by telling you other things about the world. And providing the context makes the imaginative exercise an easier one to carry out. So my suggestion here, and it's not a full-blown solution, right, what I've said right now, but my suggestion is that applying this skills-based framework to the context of imaginative resistance opens new possibilities for solutions and actually makes the phenomenon seem less puzzling than it might otherwise have initially seemed. Okay, so then let me talk about the puzzle of transformative choice. So I'm going to give you another personal example. So in the US, March and April are typically very stressful months for high school seniors in the United States because colleges issue their application decisions at that time throughout the month of March, and then students have until May 1st to decide what school they're going to commit to. So the anxiety that this process brings was recently made very vivid to me as my older son went through it. So he was having difficulty deciding between 3 different schools that he got into. The schools are all far from home, and they're in climates that are much colder than he's ever experienced growing up in Southern California, and they're located in very different kinds of environs, like a small city or a big city, and then there's one that was in a town that's far from any city. They have different educational models, and so we visited each school, got a glimpse into life at each one, but when we got home, he was well, basically, he was freaking out. He didn't know how to make his decision. And he was expressing, in a moment of this freak out and this angst, he basically told me that making the choice was impossible because there was no way to decide what life would be like at College X or College Y or College Z, no matter how many people he talked to or how much of the promotional materials from the colleges or the websites or the testimonials on Reddit, no matter how much, right, he read, he wouldn't know what going to that school was like until he was actually there, and by then it would be too late, right? At that point, the decision will have long been made. And so I told him, not that he wanted to hear this, but I told him, you've basically rediscovered Lori Paul's puzzle of transformative choice. He's never going to take a philosophy course in college. I can basically guarantee that. I would take a bet on that right now. But I told him, if you were to, take some philosophy, you've just recreated this puzzle. So the idea is that there are some experiences that are in principle epistemically inaccessible to someone who has not had the relevant experience. And this is what Lori Paul has been working on in her recent work on transformative experience. So for Paul, experiences that are transformative have both an epistemic and a personal dimension. So when something is epistemically transformative, you need the experience to learn something about it. It's epistemically inaccessible prior to having that experience. And when the experience is personally transformative, you undergo a change to your own point of view by undergoing the experience to such a degree that even your core personal preferences may be changed. And none of this is predictable in advance. So Paul thinks that many of our big life decisions end up being transformative in this sense. So she focuses quite a bit on the experience to become a parent, but also the choice of career, or the choice to undergo major surgery, and so on. And Paul argues that we're unable to engage in the kind of cognitive modeling that we normally do when we're making decisions because we don't have the relevant facts, key facts about what the experience is like that we would need to use in order to cognitively model choice X versus choice Y. We can't do that. And so Paul says, look, it doesn't matter how many parenting books you read or how much stuff you read about parenting, you're not going to be able to learn what it's like to be a parent prior to the experience. It's closed off to you. Testimony isn't enough. And she also says imagination isn't enough. So no matter how much a prospective parent tries to imagine what it would be like to have a child, no matter how much my son tries to imagine what it would be like to go to this college, it won't be enough. The knowledge remains out of reach. That's the puzzle of transformative choice. In cases involving a transformative choice, in cases where you're deciding whether to undergo a transformative experience, it seems impossible to make these choices, says Paul, rationally and authentically. But now I think that once we start to think about imagination as a skill, we can see how to put pressure on this way of thinking about the puzzle. It's undoubtedly true, I think, that many people are unable to engage in the sorts of sophisticated imaginings that they would need to in order to determine what the relevant experience would be like. But I don't think that's to say that such imaginings are, in principle, impossible. Okay, given that imagination is a skill, some people are better imaginers than others. And one thing that skilled imaginers can do, and one thing that they can do better than unskilled imaginers, is to better pull from their past experiences and extract key elements from them and mix them together. So this is a process that in other work I've called imaginative scaffolding, and it allows us to move from the familiar to the unfamiliar. So I had Temple Grandin up on a slide earlier. I skipped her because I was worried about time, but she designs equipment for livestock handling, and she describes herself as being able to take a cow's eye view of the equipment that she's designing in order to understand what it would be like to be a cow moving through the equipment. Well, think if Temple Grandin can imagine what a cow is like, it seems, and do so successfully based on the way that the equipment functions, it seems like a skilled imaginer could potentially imagine what being a parent is like. Drawing on things that you've witnessed, testimony from other people, you might be able to do it. And in fact, if you talk to enough people, and I have talked to a lot of people about this, that is not about parenting, although I've done that too, but about whether they imagined what it was like to be a parent before they were one. Some people say they did imagine it, and that it was exactly what they thought it would be, that they envisioned things directly. It's every bit as wonderful as I thought it would be, they might say, or it's just how I imagined it. Now, on Paul's view, we would have to deny that they're reporting accurately. And in general, I think that's a result that we should try to avoid when we can. That is, to deny that people are reporting correctly what their imaginative experiences were. So my point here, and I know I'm doing this very quickly in terms of trying to show you how to solve this puzzle or resolve this puzzle, but when we're talking about skilled activities and you don't have the relevant skill, the thing might look to you impossible. But things look very different from the vantage point of someone who has the relevant skill, right? So if you think about the kinds of jumps that figure skaters attempt to and work at in practice, you might think in advance that there's just no way that that could be carried out. People once thought it would be impossible for figure skaters to land quadruple jumps, but then that was done in the 80s. And at this point, the quadruple axel jump has never been successfully executed, but it was nearly pulled off at the Beijing 2022 Olympics. So if a figure skater were to tell you, oh, I'm going to attempt to do this, you might say, and you're not good at figure skating, you might just say to them, you know, that is sort of like a priori impossible, like you can't do it. And I feel like that's what's being said in the case of these imaginative feats with respect to transformative experience. But the figure skaters do pull off these jumps that look to other people to be impossible, and I think imaginers can pull off these feats if they're skilled imaginers that look to other people to be impossible. If you're going to be able to do extremely difficult figure skating moves with hard work and practice, I think a skilled imaginer can do similarly very difficult imaginative moves with enough practice and hard work and skill. So that points the way towards a possible solution to the puzzle of transformative experience. So just let me just say something very brief in conclusion of the paper, and I'll try and just do this in a couple of sentences. Thinking of imagination as a skill can help us to make progress on puzzles, but I think it can also help us to think about the way that we do philosophy. It's sort of a broader payoff, because thinking about imagination is involved in philosophy in a deep way by way of the consideration of thought experiments. And a lot of times in thought experiments, so just think about, like, say, the zombie case, for example, the philosophical zombie case about imagining a being who's microphysically identical to you, but who lacks conscious experience. Now, there are a lot of people who say, I can't imagine that, and a lot of people who say, I can. And one possibility that often doesn't come up in those discussions is that the disagreement is not that one person is wrong, but that it's a matter of imaginative skill, right? And so some people might be better at imagining the thought experiment than others. Now, maybe you don't like that so much with respect to the zombie case, but there are various other kinds of thought experiments you can think about where we might be able to see disagreements about whether the thought experiment is something that can be imagined. We might be able to resolve those disagreements by attending to imagination being a skill. So I think thinking of imagination this way has some specific payoffs in the context of philosophy of imagination, but it also has the potential to have a more broad payoff in philosophy in general. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.